So let's get this meeting going. Again, thanks everybody for being here. November 22nd, we're having our meeting, our second meeting of the year now regarding high-level radioactive materials and advisory council. Today, we're excited to be joined by the Environmental Protection Agency and our Department of Environmental Quality. But first, let me take a minute to welcome two new members. Our Department of Commerce Commissioner Josh Dagan. Are you with us, Josh?
I am.
Oh,
nice to meet all of you, and thanks, Jim.
All right, and then second, our Department of Transportation Director Ron Henke. Are you on, Ron? I see your name is there, so
I am here.
Good. Thank you for being here. Ron is a familiar face as he's attended a number of our meetings in the past. So with that being said, why don't Ed, would you please do the roll call? Let's get that taken care of.
Sure. And I apologize. My screen locked up the minute you came on, so it took me a little while to get back on. But glad everything's working well. I've gone through and I looked. I see Dave Glott is here, Ron Henke's here, Rebecca Lear, Representative Owens. I haven't seen him. He's not here. Jan Paskowski, I see, is here. Senator Patton is here. Dean Pearson is not, but as I mentioned, I don't know, Senator Patton, if you were able to hear me, because it turns out I was having computer problems, but we're looking for a new county rep because Dean Pearson from Bowman County is retired. So if there's anyone in Bowman in McKenzie or Dunn County that you'd just suggest or anywhere else, that would be great. Chairman Roars, you're here. Representative Ruby, I haven't seen him. Josh, we heard from. Ken, I saw Ken is on. Dr. Wiebe, I've not seen him. He thought he would be late coming into the meeting. And Jeb Williams, I have not seen Jeb either. But that does give us a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Good. Thank you. So yesterday, everybody was mailed out or emailed, I should say, on June 14th, our meeting minutes from June 14th, along with the agenda for today's meeting. With that, would someone entertain a motion, or I would entertain a motion for acceptance of those minutes?
So moved. This is John Paskowski.
So moved from John. Do I have a second?
This is Josh. I'll second.
All right, so moved and second. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, no hearing, no opposed, motion carries. So next on our agenda, we'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dan Schutais. Dan is the Associate Director for the Center for Waste Management and Regulation. Dan has been with the EPA for 25 years and has led or participated in numerous rulemakings over the years, including he was a part of the team developing EPA standards for the proposed repository of Yucca Mountain. So he also represents EPA in international activities, including as a member of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development of Nuclear Energy Agency Radioactive Waste Management Committee. So Dan, with that, please go ahead and introduce yourself. If there's anything I missed, that's a fairly long handle, so I might have misrepresented you. But with that being said, please go ahead with your presentation.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I have to apologize a little bit. I went to a conference last week and came back with something extra, and so I have a little residual congestion, so I hope that won't be a problem during the presentation. So I think I can share my screen here. I'll leave my video off while I'm presenting, and then we can, during the Q&A, we can have it on. So I hope everyone can see that.
You know, I did. Yeah, I would like to mention, Dan, before you get started, for the other members, if you turn off your camera and your mic, it might help with the presentation of the materials that are being presented to make sure that everything is we're getting the maximum capacity, and then we can turn our cameras and mics back on once you're done presenting during the Q&A period. So if your members could do that, please.
Okay, so I hope you can see the slides here. I'll try to keep on time. Did get the agenda, so I'll be watching the time as well. So thanks for the invitation to give a presentation here. I know you've had presentations in the past from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy. And so they've gone over some of the aspects of the larger US program that I won't then repeat. So we were asked to talk about our role in managing spent fuel and high-level waste and developing repositories. So that's actually fairly narrow. So I'll cover sort of going over a little bit what those roles and responsibilities are, but I thought I would also talk about what our specific statutory authorities are, what we have been directed to do by Congress as part of that role, the standards that we already have in place, the process that we have used to develop those standards and issue those standards, the major elements of the standards that we develop, so you can kind of see what those standards address and how they address them and what they are trying to do. Some things that we will be looking at or have been thinking about if we have to do future standards, which we anticipate we will at some point. Some of the topics that we will be looking at, and then you know, a little bit more on what we're anticipating over the next year or several years. So moving right into this, I'll just cover this. I think you've heard quite a bit of this in your previous presentations. The basic division of responsibilities amongst the federal agencies in the U.S. is EPA, NRC, and DOE. So this gives a little bit of the difference between how things are set up for the spent fuel and high-level waste, which would be Yucca Mountain or a future repository, where DOE develops the site, we develop the standards that apply, the health and radiation protection standards, and then NRC develops the licensing criteria, and they would be the licensing agency that would be evaluating DOE's application. For the waste isolation pilot plant, which I know came up a few times in your discussion with NRC, DOE develops that site. We do develop the standards, but we also are essentially playing the role of NRC in overseeing the implementation of those standards at that site. That so DOE works with us. We certify DOE's compliance with those standards at the waste isolation pilot plant, and we just completed our 4th recertification review earlier this year. So they have to do that every 5 years. That's a bit of a difference from the way that the high-level waste repository is dealt with, and that's specific to the legislation there. So our specific role, we get asked sometimes, does EPA support nuclear power? Or what's EPA's position on Yucca Mountain? Well, or some other aspect of the program. Well, we don't have a position. We are not an advocacy organization. We are an independent public health regulator. So what we do is try to determine that if an activity is taking place, that it's taking place in a way that protects public health and the environment, consistent with our mission. So what we do is we establish the basic safety standards to protect public health and the environment. We set the rules, and we have to have those rules in place before the repository can be developed and licensed, before NRC can have its broader licensing criteria, because they have to adopt our standards and then incorporate those into its larger criteria. So we kind of go first to establish those standards, and that's basically our role, and that ends our role. We have no role in any of the subsequent activities. So we don't have a role that's defined in the site selection process, the licensing process, enforcement of the license or the standards, transportation, worker protection. As I say, our mission is to protect public health. The workers are protected by NRC or OSHA or an appropriate or DOE in some cases. The performance confirmation. You heard about this. This is the post-closure monitoring that takes place subsequent to emplacement of the waste until the repository is closed, and then our standards would start to apply. But we don't have a role in what happens during that period. We follow those stages with interest. We may communicate with NRC and the DOE and other stakeholders, but we don't have a role in any of those programmatic activities that go forward after our standards have been issued. So our role is fairly narrow, but it is the first thing that has to be done, essentially. And it sets the stage for everything else. So the specific authorities that we have, going back to 1970 when the EPA was formed, a number of authorities for different programs were taken from existing agencies and given to EPA. And one of those was the function of the Atomic Energy Commission to establish generally applicable standards for the protection of the general environment from radioactive material. And this specified that it takes place, these standards apply outside the boundaries of locations under the control of persons possessing or using radioactive material. So we don't regulate inside the facility under this authority, and that's what would cover workers for the most part. So we have that basic authority. Then the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which established the repository program, directed us to use that authority essentially to develop standards for protection of the general environment from releases of radioactive material in repositories. Then the Energy Policy Act of 1992, this was after the 1987 amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act directed that Yucca Mountain be the only site investigated. The Energy Policy Act told us to promulgate by rule standards for protection of the public from releases of materials in Yucca Mountain, whether stored there or disposed there. This also told us how to do that to some extent, protecting individuals, and then also directed us to contract with the National Academy of Sciences to do a study and to be consistent with those studies. Now this, as you probably realize, this was, in addition to the selection of Yucca Mountain sort of prematurely, this also created some distrust with the public. Because essentially you said, we've chosen the site, now you set the rules for that site. We don't want the rules that already existed for any site. You set the rules for that particular site. So that made many stakeholders, including the state of Nevada, concerned that the standards would be written to allow the site to be licensed and not to protect the public. And so we certainly did not agree with that, but we understand that perception, and we worked very hard to alleviate those concerns. Moving on, so the standards that we have in place, we've developed two sets of standards following those different statutory directions. So we did issue generally applicable standards, not only for spent fuel and for high-level waste, but also for transuranic waste, which is elements heavier than uranium, generally not heat-generating waste, but it is a byproduct of the nuclear weapons program. And so there is a lot of it that DOE has. So this goes back, we issued a rule and a proposed rule and a final rule. We had to amend the final rule because there were some procedural problems. The court ruled that we had not followed the proper procedures to put the elements of the final rule in place, so we had to redo that rule. Those standards right now would apply to any repository other than Yucca Mountain. And Congress did, in the WIPP Land Withdrawal Act of 1992, specify that they should be applied to WIPP and that EPA should be the certifying authority to implement those standards at WIPP, which we have done for since WIPP opened nearly 25 years ago. We also issued our Yucca Mountain site-specific standards pursuant to the Energy Policy Act. We had the proposal out in 1999, final rule in 2001. Again, we had a lawsuit where the court disagreed with the way we had done something. This was a case where it was not a procedural problem, but it was a problem where they found that the provision dealing with the compliance period, the length of time that these standards apply to the repository was not consistent with what the national academies had recommended. And so we had to address that concern and issued our final standards in 2008. So the process, as you noted from the statutory language, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, going with the state government, notice and comment rulemaking. So we issue a proposed rule, we take public comment on that, we then finalize the rule, and we also have to respond to the public comments at that time, explaining why we accepted or how we viewed some of the comments and justifying further, why we chose the approach that we did. Now, during the entire process of developing the rule, we have informal interactions with NRC and DOE and other stakeholders. We are open to having meetings with stakeholders who are interested in talking with us about their thoughts. We record those, we put them in the docket for the rulemaking. They are publicly available. Anyone can see who came in to meet with us and see a summary of the meeting. But that process becomes much more constrained once we submit a draft of the rule to the Office of Management and Budget, which then manages the process, and all of those interactions would go through OMB. So we do continue to interact with NRC and DOE during that process, but there is opportunity for public input. It just has to go through OMB and not through us. So these interactions are very important because, as I said, we go first, and so what we have in place has to stand up to whatever happens in the rest of the process. So it's very important for us to have our standards that are very clear. We don't want ambiguity. We want NRC and DOE and the public to understand what the standard is, how it was derived, what it requires in terms of compliance demonstrations and all of those things. So ambiguity is not a good thing if you have people wondering, what does this mean as they're trying to license a repository? We try to make our standards adaptable and not too rigid, because there will be unexpected things that come up, and we want the process to be able to handle those and implement the standards effectively. As I say, implementable. The bottom line is NRC has to be able to use our standard to judge whether DOE is in compliance and has met the requirements of the protection standards. DOE has to understand what is required of it and be able to demonstrate that. Not that they be able to meet the standards, but they be able to demonstrate clearly whether they do or they don't. There's a process there that they can use. We definitely want them to be defensible. You saw we've had previous standards rejected, like either procedurally or substantively, based on legal challenge. We're always subject to legal challenge, and so we try to clearly lay out our approach, our thought process, our justification for what we put out, why it's consistent with the statute, why it's appropriate to do it that way, and hopefully that is good enough. And then in terms of being robust, it has to stand the test of time. The repository program will take decades. We are at a point where if we go for a new repository, it will take quite some time to come up with a citing process, and then to come up with a site and to characterize the sites. There will probably be multiple sites that will be characterized. That is a multi-decade process. And so the standard has to be forward-looking to the point where it's not something that becomes so outdated that it can't be used for some reason halfway through the process. So we are very much aware of that possibility. And we've seen this, in other countries as well. So just a bit about what we look at when we develop standards. The standards at the bottom line is they're a basic measure of the ability of the disposal system to contain and isolate the waste, and then to contain and isolate the waste to the point where the public is protected and the environment is protected. So we look at some very basic elements of this. And one of those is, who are we protecting with this standard? We could be protecting humans specifically. We could be protecting the environment, and those things in some ways overlap. We have done standards that address both. We have standards that are protect individuals with radiation exposure limits, a dose. We have to define who that person is. Where do they live? What's their lifestyle? What is their diet? Is it locally grown? Is it not? How do they access groundwater? How else might they be exposed to radionuclides that are released from a repository? So we have to think about those things. We have also had standards that protect the environment in some ways. Groundwater protection standards have been elements of both of our standards. So we might also limit overall releases. We have that's the primary protection standard at WIP, is the amount of material that can be released from the repository. And that's derived based on assumptions about exposures to a population. Compliance demonstrations. These are not facilities where you can go out and measure it easily. You're looking at timeframes that are in the thousands of years at least. So really, mathematical modeling is the way that we demonstrate protection. You can see one of the figures here is a chart that illustrates how we show the compliance at the WIP. This is a probability of release versus a quantity of release. Cumulative release is over 10,000 years. So the lines here, the dark line is DOE's projection. The lighter sort of brownish line is our, we've done some sensitivity studies. We've modified some parameters that we thought were not appropriate, and that's the curve we came up with. The dashed line off to the side, that's the compliance line. So you can see that we find that the facility remains in compliance even with the adjustments that we made. So that's the kind of analysis that we do at WIP. In general, you look at all of the features, events, and processes that are present in the repository that represent the disposal system, and develop a model that incorporates those, looks possibly at how they vary. You might do probabilistic modeling or some deterministic modeling where you're just looking at certain cases. We don't look at the worst case. We want what we call a reasonable expectation. So we don't necessarily look at the worst case, the most highly exposed person. We look at someone who is fairly at the high end, but not necessarily the most exposed person. And we want to see generally, does the performance assessment represent a good understanding of the disposal system? So that's what we would be trying to elucidate from the modeling process. And then a key element here is, how long do we apply these standards? The WIP standards, as I mentioned, apply for 10,000 years. Well, 10,000 years is not as long as it used to be in this kind of case. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that we have a lot more experience in understanding how these types of facilities would work. What are the processes and that are in effect here? It's fairly clear that a repository can be engineered with certain materials to last for more than 10,000 years. So we don't want to discount that longer time period. So 10,000 years may not be sufficient to capture the material that comes out of the repository. It probably would not be. Other reasons that where we have to look at periods beyond 10,000 years, the capability of modeling has grown astronomically over the past 30 years or so. Our knowledge, as I say, of the processes that take place, our ability to develop sophisticated computer models, translate those processes into mathematical models, and then just the computing power itself. Simulations that used to take weeks can now be done in a matter of hours. And so generating numbers for 1 million years or even more than that is much simpler than it used to be. And so we, in our Yucca Mountain standards and other countries, I think we have made it impossible not to look out to at least 1 million years for these types of applications. And of course, this is longer than any other human activity is regulated or even contemplated. You can see over on the right here, we're even talking about evolutionary timescales. Modern humans have existed for somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 years, maybe a little bit more. But there were several other precursors or relatives of modern humans that were flourishing within the last 1 million years. So when we're defining who the receptor is, we can get very speculative. It could be anyone, with such highly advanced technologies. We've had it suggested to us that cancers will be cured by the time we have a repository in place. So there's no point in limiting the amount of radiation exposure that someone can get. Those are the kind of speculative things that we try to avoid. And so one of the things that we would look at is in defining who the receptor is someone who lives a lot like they do today. That is something that we can, in some sense, justify. So these are some basic elements that we grapple with to try to put them together in a way that makes sense for a standard that can apply to a facility of this nature. And in some cases, the statutory language tells us what we have to do. The Energy Policy Act told us to protect individuals by establishing a dose limit. So to be consistent with the statutory language, that was the approach that we chose. It might not be the approach that we would always choose, but that was the approach that we chose in that case. So as we're looking to the future, in addition to those basic elements that I just discussed, we're also evaluating some other things, such as different geologic media. The U.S. has for the past 30 years been focused on volcanic tuff as the medium that's going to be used. But there are several others out there internationally that are present in the U.S. We've learned a lot about salt in working with the WIP and in working with other countries such as Germany that has a lot of salt. They have a lot of experience with salt. But there's also granitic and clay type of environments that we need to understand how they work. The concepts of retrievability and reversibility. Retrievability has been around for a long time. Reversibility is a newer concept. And what's shown here is an example of the way that it's applied in Belgium. That up to a certain point you can stop your program and sort of take it on a different path. Also referred to under different names like adaptive phased management, those sorts of things. I mentioned retrievability. I know this came up when you were talking with Tim McCartan from the NRC and mentioned retrievability at WIP in the salt environment there. So even though the salt will creep over the waste canisters that are there, we do require that DOE be able to retrieve waste for a certain period after disposal. And we've made it clear that doesn't necessarily have to be easy or cheap, but they have to have the capability to do that. So they have provided plans to be able to do that. And that would be essentially if there was a compromise in repository safety, which we don't really anticipate at WIP, but in terms of being prepared for that. There are economic requirements to be able to retrieve waste from a high level waste repository for reprocessing of spent fuel, for example. Human intrusion is always an element of an analysis that people have dealt with in various ways. We have dealt with it in various ways. We deal with it at WIP in a very different way than we dealt with it at Yucca Mountain, because WIP is in a basin that is highly subject to oil and gas drilling. And so we use that history to project the potential for someone to drill into the repository at some time in the future and penetrate the waste. At Yucca Mountain, there are no such resources. So we used a sort of a simple water drilling type scenario, a single penetration, and see how the repository responds to that. So there are different ways of thinking about that overall, and that's gone in different ways internationally as well. Advanced reactors is a big issue right now. We've heard quite a bit over the last couple of weeks at different conferences. There are many advanced reactors that are under development. Some are going to be going through pilot demonstration projects in the next 5 to 10 years. They have very different fuels and waste forms. We don't know how they will behave. We don't know what they do over time. The chart here is from the IAEA. They show this is a small handful of the types of designs that they have. We heard mention of more than 80 designs that are out there right now that are being tested of different technologies altogether. The thermal effects are very important to manage those at a high-level waste repository. How do you do that? So we are learning quite a bit about this. DOE has odds and ends of these types of things that they have had over the years from various research projects. And at this point, they represent a very tiny fraction of the overall inventory. But if these advanced reactors become more prominent, if they become the future of nuclear power, it's going to be the bulk of that. And so there are very different considerations that have to be taken into account. Borehole disposal, I know in North Dakota, DOE attempted to do a test. This graphic here shows this is a concept from the deep isolation company that's been working on its technology as well, using the directional drilling techniques that have been prominent in the unconventional oil and gas that is also very familiar to North Dakota. We anticipate having standards that deal specifically with borehole disposal. Our generic standards they apply to any land disposal, but they are not tailored in any specific way for boreholes. And so we would be looking at how to do that. And then looking internationally, as we have in the past, this shows the concept that Sweden has developed for its disposal facility, which is in a licensing process right now and may be approved within the next year or so and begin construction. But there are several countries that have made a lot of progress, and we will be looking carefully at how they've done that and the standards that they have in place, as we did for the Yucca Mountain rulemaking. And so we anticipate early public engagement when the time is right to kind of hear what people have to say, put out some of our thinking, and get some feedback on that. So this is my last substantive slide. We do anticipate congressional direction. We've seen several bills introduced over the past nearly 10 years. None has really gone very far. None have come out of committee. We're hearing now that there may be some additional activity that will be coming at some point. So we're watching that carefully. If the roadblocks to Yucca Mountain were taken away and that project somehow became back on track, well, the legal challenge that we have awaiting us from the state of Nevada would probably be revived, and we would have to defend those standards in court again. We've considered that updating our generic standards could affect how they apply to WIP, so we are thinking that's probably not what we would want to do. We would probably want to develop new standards unless we were directed to do something different. Here's a quote from the Blue Ribbon Commission from 2012 that explicitly said, EPA and NRC develop a generic disposal standard and supporting regulatory requirements early in the siting process. I mentioned the problem with Yucca Mountain and the suspicion that the standards were being written to the site. That's not a situation we want to have. But again, standards early in the siting process, you're looking then at decades, and so those standards have to be able to hold up under those changing conditions. And the interest from various stakeholders. Last week we heard some papers from certain stakeholders that were offering their thoughts on what we should do for new standards. So we're interested, of course, in that and interacting with the stakeholders, as I mentioned on the previous slide. So we're doing a lot of preliminary thinking about process and the necessary resources for us to be able to do this. Right now, we have no direction to do it, but we want to be prepared, and we want to be well positioned when we actually have to do something, that we have a solid base of work that we can rely on at that point. So that concludes my presentation. I'll be glad to take questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan. Members, please remember to turn your camera and your mics back on now. And does anyone have questions for Dan? I guess I'll start with one question while you think about it. Dan, when does this hit a point of critical mass where something has to be done? I think you indicated that at present time you're in a rulemaking, but you really don't have a directive to get something done by a certain date, right? When we hit that point?
Well, we're actually not now. There's no activity, there's no formal activity right now, because the law says Yucca Mountain is the repository, and there's no alternative to it. And so the Yucca Mountain, I think, as you heard from Tim McCartan, the licensing process at NRC is suspended. They don't have the funding to continue it. So things are just essentially in limbo. So we are right now, we're not doing anything. We've done what Congress has told us to do. So we anticipate we will be told to do something, to develop new standards, but we have not heard that yet.
Okay.
So
the real concern are the spent cells that we're faced with trying to deal with from nuclear power plants, correct? And when is that going to become a critical situation, or will it ever become critical? I mean, I guess.
Well, it's critical, and you don't want to imply that they're not being stored safely, because it is being stored safely. But that on-site storage, the dry cask storage even, was not intended to be a permanent solution. It was not even intended to be a solution for as long as it has been. The anticipation was that DOE would have taken possession of that fuel and be putting it in a repository by now. So that has not worked. Now, as you're aware that there are private efforts to develop interim storage where some of that fuel can be moved off the reactor sites into a centralized location. That would probably, I'm sure that would be safe. It would be licensed by the NRC. I'm sure it would be safe. It would allow those sites that have been decommissioned, except for the remaining spent fuel, to be fully decommissioned, and for that property to be repurposed, which would be a good thing. And then DOE also, of course, has started its consent-based siting effort for interim storage that would be DOE interim storage, and they've gotten authorization to go forward with that process. So I think there's recognition that the continued storage at the reactor sites, while it is safe, it is not the optimal solution. It is not the optimal condition for things to be in now. And the longer it's there, the more likely it is that something could happen, whether it's an extreme weather event or something else. Just the infrastructure over time, excuse me, becoming less sustainable. So it seems like things are moving in that direction to address that issue. But it's not an urgent, it's not an immediate safety concern. And I would not want people to think that it is. So
I appreciate that. I just, you gave me the answer I wanted. It's not imminent. We can continue to talk about it for a long, long time. So other questions for Dan?
Mr. Chairman, Ed Murphy, if I could ask Dan, when talking about advanced reactors, are you talking about reactors that would then use spent fuel?
well, some of those designs, yes, they would. Some of the fast reactors could potentially use the spent fuel that's now in storage as the continued fuel source, because it can, the higher burnups that, and whatever's left over then has to be considered, for the repository. And that's where some of the thermal concerns come from, the higher burnups and the higher thermal activity. But yes, potentially some of those designs could use the existing spent fuel as the feedstock.
And then you mentioned the WIP site and trying to go back into that site if need be to retrieve the waste. And I've been in Saskatoon in the potash mine, 3,000 feet down with a large cutter. And I just can't imagine going in trying to make sure you don't hit the canisters and the drums and things.
Well, it wouldn't be something that would be done lightly. As I said, likely only for a reason that would compromise the safety of the repository. And it doesn't seem like that is a concern with the type of waste that is disposed of at WIP. Now, the DOE is going to be disposing of a lot more surplus plutonium there than was originally intended. And we have yet to see a good analysis of that material in the repository over time. So there may be additional concerns that get raised by that material, the large amount that's anticipated going into that repository.
Thank you.
Questions? All right. Hearing none, Dan, thank you very much for your time and your information. I appreciate it very much. With that, let's go on to our second speaker is David Stradinger, and David has worked for the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality for 12 years. And of those years, the last 2 years as a manager of the Radiation and Indoor Quality Control Program. Prior to that, David served 29 years he spent 29 years of radiation experienced worker in the medical center in Bismarck. So David, welcome. Would you please go forward? And again, committee members, now's the time to turn off your mics and cameras so we can maximize our reception. Okay.
Well, thank you, Chairman Roars, and thank you, council members, for the invite. I appreciate being able to speak with you today. I'll look to share my screen here. Is everybody able to see my screen at this point?
Looks good, David. We got it. It's got it up in front of us.
Okay, very good. Okay. Like I said, my name is Dave Stradinger. I'm the manager of the Radiation Indoor Air Quality Control Program. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide a general insight into high-level and low-level radioactive wastes, and also provide some information regarding T-norm wastes. We'll start off with the two broad classifications of radioactive waste, that being high-level and low-level radioactive waste. High-level radioactive waste primarily is uranium fuel that has been used in a nuclear power reactor or power plant and is spent or no longer efficient in producing electricity. Spent fuel is thermally hot as well as highly radioactive and requires remote handling and shielding. During the fission process in the reactors, radioactive isotopes of lighter elements such as cesium-137 and strontium-90 are also produced. These isotopes or fission products account for most of the heat and penetrating radiation in the high-level waste. Some of the uranium atoms capture neutrons during the process, forming heavier elements. And as mentioned before, these heavier than uranium or transuranic elements do not produce near as much heat or penetrating radiation, but do take much longer to decay. And as such, transuranic wastes, or true TRU wastes, account for most of the radioactive hazard that remains in high-level waste after 1,000 years. And transuranic wastes generally consists of protective clothing, tools, equipment, that sort of thing. Bear with me 1 second. There we go. In nuclear fission, atoms are split apart. It's in the diagram here with uranium-235, and that releases energy. Nuclear power plants use nuclear fission, and most nuclear power plants use uranium atoms. During nuclear fission, a neutron collides with the uranium atom and splits it, releases a large amount of energy in the form of heat and radiation. And from that conversion, from that heat is how they're able to produce the electricity. More neutrons are also released when the uranium atom splits, and these neutrons continue to collide with other uranium atoms, and the process repeats itself over and over again, continuously being able to produce the electricity. This process is called a nuclear chain reaction, and the reaction is controlled in the nuclear power plant reactors to produce a desired amount of heat. Here we have a depiction of a nuclear fuel assembly. So nuclear fuel consists of ceramic pellets of uranium-235 stacked inside of metal rods. The pellets are approximately 1 centimeter in diameter and 1 centimeter long. A single pellet in the typical reactor yields about the same amount of energy as 1 ton of steaming coal. And these rods are bound together to form a fuel assembly. The typical number of fuel rods per assembly varies by reactor design and can be between 49 to over 300 rods per assembly. The number of assemblies in reactor core and the frequency of loading and discharging assemblies in and out of the reactor depends on the reactor type and power production. For example, an 1100 megawatt electric pressure water reactor may contain 193 fuel assemblies, composed of over 50,000 fuel rods and some 18 million fuel pellets. In addition to nuclear power plants, United States Navy is another source of spent nuclear fuel. When a ship's power reactors are refueled or defueled, the spent nuclear fuel needs to be transported to the Naval Reactors Facility at Idaho National Laboratory for inspection. Since 1957, the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program has safely and securely completed almost 1,000 shipments of spent nuclear fuel from various ports to the Idaho National Laboratory. One big difference between the Navy nuclear fuel is in a solid metal form compared to the ceramic form in power plants. It's non-flammable and it's designed to withstand intense battle shock. Some of the major concerns with high-level radioactive waste include the potential for high radiation exposures, heat generation, and storage options, of which we've previously discussed with Daniel's presentation. Currently, there's no permanent repository for this waste. The Yucca Mountain site in Nevada was the proposed spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste repository, where both types of radioactive waste could be disposed of. In the years following, as we've spoken previously, various actions have halted the development and licensing of the site. There have been some work recently on interim storage options, but this continues to be met with some pushback. The proposed interim storage sites were located, one in southeastern New Mexico, the Holtec International site, and also western Texas, the interim storage partners site. So you continue to see things pop up in the news as far as the different challenges that these proposed sites are going through. So currently all United States nuclear power plants store their spent nuclear fuel on site in spent fuel pools. The pools are made of reinforced concrete several feet thick with steel liners. The water is typically about 40 feet deep and serves both to shield and cool the fuel rods. As the pools near capacity, some of the older spent fuel is moved into dry storage. If you look at the image here on the left, you'll notice kind of a blue glow in the pool. This is due to what's known as shrink-off radiation. And shrink-off radiation is a form of energy that we can perceive as a blue glow emitted when the electrically charged particles that compose atoms, the electrons and protons, are moving at speeds faster than that of light in a medium. This is something also not only you'll see in these spent fuel pools, but also when we look at irradiators, large irradiators that are looking to sterilize packages, medical equipment, things like that. They have very high activities of typically cesium-137 or cobalt-60, which would also demonstrate that shrink-off radiation. Here's a couple examples of the dry storage that you'll know about. The photo on the left is an example of a vertical storage, and the one on the right is an example of a horizontal storage. So after the material is taken out of the pools, it's put into the dry casks and then placed inside these vaults. And if and when there is an option for interim or final disposal of the materials, the casks would be removed from the vaults and placed in approved shipping containers for transport. Now, transportation of high-level radioactive waste creates many challenges. You need to have adequate shipping containers that need to meet strict requirements for approval, the security of the material during shipment, routing challenges, including proximity transportation outlets, waterways, trucking, railways. A lot of these nuclear power plants, when they were constructed, they had railways that were bringing materials in, and during the construction phase and over time, these have degraded or have been removed altogether. So these are some of the challenges when we're looking to possibly move these materials again in the future. These shipments of the higher levels of radioactive material also require inspections prior to shipment and also along the shipment routes and also upon receipt. Here's an example of an approved shipping container, the M290 shipping container. You'll see the one on the left, that's one located on a rail car. And then you'll see on the image on the right, it's a typical rail car that would be at the end. That's where the security personnel would be during the transportation process. As mentioned before, these shipping containers go through rigorous testing procedures prior to approval for use. And that continues ongoing at this point as I think the DOE and some of the railway commissions are continuing to go through the approval processes for additional shipping containers. Now, those transuranic wastes, we've talked a little bit, I guess, about the waste isolation pilot plant. The waste isolation pilot plant, or WIP, it's located outside of Carlsbad, New Mexico. It was constructed for the disposal of defense-generated transuranic waste from Department of Energy sites around the country. Typically, transuranic waste, again, consists of clothing, tools, rags, residues, debris, soils, and other items contaminated with small amounts of plutonium and other man-made radioactive elements. The waste is permanently disposed of in rooms mined in an underground salt bed layer over 2,000 feet from the surface. So all Department of Energy transuranic waste destined for WIP disposal must be characterized using an EPA-approved waste characterization program and be tracked from generation through disposal. The Department of Energy's waste data system tracks each waste container from generation through a characterization, storage, certification, shipment, and replacement at WIP. I do have, there was a link here to a short video. It's about two and a half minutes. I'll put that in the chat if people want to look at it. With Teams, we had some difficulties not being able to hear the audio on that. So I'll put that in the chat later if you want to look at it. It gives a little quick overview of the WIP site and how over time, after these, you've got these containers of radioactive waste, the transuranic waste in there. Over time, the salt bed will basically encapsulate the material as it just comes down and engulfs the area and fills in all the gaps and shields the material. This is just a example of a transuranic waste transportation container. You can see it's the TruPack 2. You can see there's barrels located in the center of it. You've got some liners around it. So not only keeping the material intact, but also providing shielding for radiation exposure during transport. And some of the typical transport routes that you'll see for transportation of transuranic waste to WIP are shown in the image here. And you'll notice that, typically, you don't see any through North Dakota. Not at this time. High-level radioactive waste is regulated by multiple authorities. The Department of Energy plans and carries out programs for safe handling of Department of Energy generated radioactive waste, develops waste disposal technologies, and will design, construct, and operate disposal facilities for Department of Energy generated and commercial high-level waste. The NRC licenses and regulates the receipt and possession of high-level waste at privately owned facilities and certain Department of Energy facilities, such as the interim storage sites. Facilities for permanent disposal will also require license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The EPA develops environmental standards and federal protection guidance for offsite radiation due to the disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level transuranic waste. The Department of Transportation regulates both the packaging and carriage of all hazardous materials, including radioactive waste. And the Department of the Interior, through the United States Geological Survey, conducts laboratory and field geologic investigations in support of the Department of Energy's waste disposal programs and collaborates with the Department of Energy on the earth science technical activities. Low-level waste, on the other hand, which are generally defined as radioactive waste other than high-level waste and waste from uranium recovery operations, are commonly disposed in near-surface facilities rather than deep geological repositories. Low-level wastes include materials that have been contaminated with radioactive materials or have been made radioactive through exposure to neutron radiation. Examples are activated products. Examples of low-level waste includes contaminated personal protection equipment, rags, mops, filters, residues, equipment, tools, dials, medical tubes, a lot of things from medical facilities and laboratories. The radioactivity from this waste ranges from background levels found in nature to higher levels, such as from parts inside a reactor vessel. Low-level waste is typically stored at the licensee's or the generator site, either until it has decayed away or can be disposed of as ordinary trash, or until they have enough material there to warrant a shipment. Examples of low-level waste generators in North Dakota include our two state universities, NDSU and UND, and some of the major medical facilities that have nuclear medicine and or radiation therapy programs, otherwise known as radioactive material programs. So you've got different specimens from laboratory testing from the universities, and so they have a lot of materials that are used in these processes that in the end are categorized as low-level waste and have to be disposed of as such. There are currently 4 active low-level waste disposal sites. Energy Solutions Barnwell operations, located in Barnwell, South Carolina, accepts waste from the Atlantic Compact States, which are Connecticut, New Jersey, and South Carolina. Barnwell is licensed by the state of South Carolina to dispose of Class A, B, and C waste. Classification of low-level radioactive waste for near-surface disposal is according to its radiological hazard. The classes include Class A, B, and C, with Class A being the least hazardous and accounting for 96% of the low-level waste. As the waste class and hazard increase, the regulations established by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission require progressively greater controls to protect the health and safety of the public and the environment. There's US Ecology, located in Richland, Washington. They accept waste from the Northwest and Rocky Mountain compacts, which include Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Utah, Washington, Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico. Richland is licensed by the state of Washington to dispose of Class A, B, and C low-level waste. Energy Solutions, Clive Operations, located in Clive, Utah, accepts waste from all regions of the United States, and Clive is licensed by the state of Utah for Class A waste only. Waste Control Specialist, located near Andrews, Texas, accepts waste from the Texas compact generators and outside generators with permission from the compact, and they're licensed to dispose of Class A, B, and C waste. North Dakota is a part of the Southwestern Low-Level Radioactive Waste Compact, and waste generators need to petition the Southwestern Compact for disposal of their low-level radioactive waste prior to shipment. And as the Southwest Compact's host state, California, does not have a permanent disposal site, the Southwest Compact acquires permission from the Texas Compact to ultimately dispose of the North Dakota low-level waste in Texas. Some of the regulatory authorities for low-level waste include the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Transportation, and also the Department of Energy. Shifting further down the line for different types of waste, we have the TNORM waste, which is technologically enhanced natural occurring radioactive material. And these wastes are predominantly generated by the oil and gas industry in North Dakota. Common examples of TNORM waste streams include production water, scale, sludge, filter cake, filter socks, synthetic proppants, and contaminated soils and equipment. When the existing concentrations of natural occurring radioactive materials are changed, they are considered to be technologically enhanced and become regulated. So we have produced water that's comes up from our oil and gas wells, and this material has solids suspended in it. And these wastes, as they are processed, the solids are removed, and whether it be through a filter press, centrifuge, things like that, and they're able to, in some cases, reuse the water, and also with sludges in the bottom of the tank, same kind of a thing where they can reuse the oil and sell the oil that's in the tank bottoms. And so these different filter cakes that are produced, and the sludge and the filter socks that filter this, they are the sources of your TNORM waste. So you see examples on the picture on the right hand side there. You see some standard TNORM waste in a collection bin. The second picture shows a used filter sock, and then we also have the pipe scale, the scale that builds up inside of pipes over time. And as this concentration of the natural occurring material increases, it's now a regulated TNORM. The North Dakota Radiological Health Rules require possession of a specific radioactive materials license for the possession, use, storage, and transport of TNORM. License activities include decontamination, decommissioning, processing, transport, and disposal. Decontamination licensees remove TNORM from TNORM impacted materials such as pipes, equipment, and soils resulting from activities in the oil and gas industry. Another example, which we talked would be decontamination of saltwater disposal facilities or saltwater injection wells. Some of these we've seen that have been destroyed by fires caused by lightning strikes. And as these fires burn down the tanks, which are often housing TNORM impacted materials, which is the sludge that's built up in the bottom of the tanks, and that ultimately ends up spilling onto soils both on and off site. A process uses the shakers, centrifuges, and filter presses to remove the natural occurring radioactive material solids to produce a saleable, reusable product. The photo on the left shows you a filter press. And if you can see, there's kind of a filter press on the top where the yellow rail is. And basically it squeezes out the reusable fluids out of it. And then the solids drop down into a storage container down below, which is for ultimate transport for disposal. On the right, you see this is a unit that is, it's an enclosed pipe cleaning or decontamination system. So they'll either rattle the pipes or run a wire, a power brush or high pressure water to remove the scale that's inside and also outside the pipe, to where the pipe can either be reused or it can be taken to a recycle center for recycling. Licensees that possess TNORM at their physical locations are also required to maintain financial assurance to cover the potential costs in decommissioning the facilities. Processing and decontamination or decommissioning licensees are required to set forth a minimum of $225,000 up to $1,125,000 for financial assurance. The total amount is dependent on the amount of TNORM that they possess at any one time. Landfills, currently we have the one landfill in North Dakota that is permitted and licensed to accept TNORM waste. They are required and have secured financial assurance in the amount of $1,125,000. Currently, the solid waste disposal limit for TNORM waste in North Dakota is 25,000 tons per year at concentrations not to exceed 50 picocuries per gram. There's currently one landfill licensed and permitted in TNORM waste in North Dakota, and this is Secure Energy Services, which is located near Williston. Excuse me. Another TNORM landfill application has been received for Wisco, which is located west of Williston. There's also one licensed and permitted facility currently authorized to process TNORM and inject the TNORM waste slurry into a Class 2 injection well, and this is KT Enterprises in McKenzie County. As mentioned before, transportation TNORM requires possession of a radioactive material license. In addition to the radioactive material license, TNORM transporters are also required to possess a solid waste hauler's permit issued by the Solid Waste Program. Transporters are also required to submit quarterly reports to the department, indicating the types and amounts of TNORM materials transported, including the origin and destination information. Shipping papers or manifests are also required to be completed and maintained by all the entities involved in the transportation process. The image here shows a vac truck that would be a typical unit that would be used to vacuum out the tank sludge that builds up in the bottom of the tank and transport it to a processing facility for processing. The sole authority for the regulation of TNORM in North Dakota is the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality, specifically the Radiation Control Program and solid waste programs within the Division of Waste Management. There's no federal authority for TNORM. It's been left up to the states, and I think as we see time progress, we're going to see more and more states develop their TNORM regulations. And that is all I have at this point, and I appreciate
Thank you.
your time.
David? Yeah, David, thank you. Committee members, again, turn on your mics and cameras, and anyone have any questions for David right now? Well, David, hearing no questions, that obviously means that you did a superb job. So I see that Ed has his hand up. Ed, you got a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious, Dave, if so the majority of TNORM is that tank sludge in North Dakota, or it's just variable throughout?
Well, I think it's we have a variety of sources. A lot of it's from tank sludge. That's where you're going to see the processors looking to resell the product because you've still got saleable oil in there, and there's also water that is separated out as well. You know, they can reuse the water. You know, not only in they can sell it and continue to use it for, completion services, and just continuing the process. So we see a lot of filter stock generation, not only at the saltwater injection wells, when they go to inject the production water downhole, it goes through these filter socks, and that's where over time they can accumulate the solids. And I think if we all recall, several years ago, we had several instances where we were finding these materials in places they weren't supposed to be, such as a Newton gas station, for example. And, with the help and working together with the NDIC, the Industrial Commission, we're able to have them require containers for those filter socks on all the drilling sites. So that's really reduced that problem. But so we see those filter socks build up as well. And we have companies that are licensed to transport these filter socks. And currently the filter socks are going out of state. But the majority is, these, you see the production waters and the tank bottom wastes. We're starting to see more, as they call themselves, pipe cleaning companies, which are actually decontaminating the materials. So that's been where we've been looking further into, and as we see more areas where T-norm waste is being produced, again, we continue to follow upon those. So.
Okay, other questions from other members? All right, thank you again, David. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Just for the record, I'd like Ed to note, I think Dan, Representative Ruby is now with us, so let's have the record show that Dan is here. Members, I guess we've now heard from the 3 federal agencies on high-level radioactive waste, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agencies. So we've gotten reports from each of these departments. And I guess the question now would be is, what do we want to do for the next time, in the next period? What would you like to hear and learn more about? Does anybody have some ideas or input as to what would be of interest to this advisory board?
I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me, Chairman Roars?
Yes, very well, very loud and clear. Your visual is not very clear, but your voice is very clear.
Okay. I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I wanted to thank you for you and Ed for having David here, because I think he did a really good job of explaining some basic things. For instance, like high and low radioactive waste and T-norm. It's like a different language, and for some of the people on our council, especially the people that are just coming on, it takes a long time to kind of get comfortable with all that terminology, and that, I think that was very good for you guys to put this speaker in here. I also like the question that you asked earlier to Daniel, when you asked him, basically, is there any movement or concerns happening that we should be concerned with at this time? And it was kind of a transitional statement. And I tried to chime in because I wanted to ask a question, and maybe this would be a good place to go with our next meeting, but there is movement happening with site-based meetings. And I know that Daniel said he's not really the person for EPA with public engagement, really doesn't have any role, but $16 million has now been put out there between January and September of this year for site-based grants to have this discussion in your community. That makes me think things are moving. And so that might be something to look into. How is that being handled? And are people biting on the 16 million? Hopefully no one in North Dakota. Being from Rugby, I don't know, maybe our larger council here doesn't know who I am or anything, but we had this come into our community, and the site-based consent was non-existent. And so I'm just wondering if that's a flag we could follow and see what's happening with someone to speak to us about that part of the larger process that's happening with nuclear high level radioactive waste being, since it can't go to Yucca Mountain, finding that place. I liked your question very much, Chairman Roars. Is this something happening now that's moving around? And that, just watching that since January has made me think things are moving.
Sure, excellent. And Rebecca, tell me more about the $16 million and where you see that. You're obviously picking up on something from someplace. What is it? Where's this coming from? Where can we go?
I'm going to see if I can't find you some information here while you're, if you want to take any other questions, I'll look up for you.
Well, and Rebecca, we can follow up with that. That would be great to know, and that would give us a direction of where we might go to find someone to address what is the intent of that $16 million? And you're absolutely right. If there's money out there, there's somebody doing something to use it, that's for sure.
Right.
So
I know they had the DOE, Department of Energy, did have like I'm on a couple of sites where I can watch this type of news, and I did get like an email invitation from the Department of Energy for a live webinar. They had a little live feed that you could watch. That's where I got the information in January and in September. So through the Department of Energy, Chairman Roars, that's where it was generated.
Okay.
And Dan has his hand up, so he could, I think he can respond.
Hey, I see that. Thank you. I didn't see the hand until you told me. Dan, do you have a comment, please?
Yes, I think I can give you a little bit of that. So yes, so DOE put out a funding opportunity, is what they call it, for individuals, groups, communities. It's not limited to, who want to explore what consent-based siting means. So it's not necessarily asking for host communities or volunteers to host a site, but it's really a fairly broad opportunity to get some funding to explore various aspects of this concept. And I think they are still, I don't think that period, the funding opportunity has closed yet. Let's see, I'm finding it here. So let me share my screen here just for a moment, and I can show you this site that DOE has. If you can see that.
Yep, we got it.
Okay, so this is Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy, and there's the URL. So this is what they are providing, $16 million funding opportunity announcement. So that was, they have the announcement down here. I think it was in the Federal Register, and a fact sheet. So this is what it is. If you're interested, a teaming partner list. Here's how to submit if you want to be on that list. So there's just looking at this now. So I guess there's a little video here. I guess this is probably a recording of the announcement meeting. I attended that as well, but it's recorded. So this would be, I think, the place to go, first place to go to find out more about this funding opportunity and see whether it is something that you would like to discuss or hear more about at future meetings.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I think we'll look into that. And Rebecca, you can certainly chime in, please, with any intel that you may have or your questions you have. So, okay.
My purpose of bringing it up wasn't so much that I'm thinking, oh, do we want to get funding from this and start this conversation of possible consent-based siting? No, my question or my insight was that seeing that this is moving makes me think things are moving.
Well,
but I can get you more information from what I have.
I think the fact that $16 million is on the table, you need to ask the question, who's applying for it? Because it could be someone in our geographical area that we don't know yet. So,
Very good.
yeah. So,
Very-
all right. Anything more from any members? I've got one thing that I want to float out there too that I think, Ed, maybe we could consider, and that is that, as was talked about earlier, I think Dan referred to the amount of unused energy in these cells, these fuel cells, and the ability to somehow capture a portion of that unused energy. Should we or could we be looking into any efforts there is to do that? And, you know, as a state that's about energy of all kinds, should we be investigating some of these smaller electrical generation opportunities that use up some of that energy? Is that something that would be of interest to anybody?
I think that gets us back to having that material brought back into our small communities and our rural state, which is pretty much where we were in 2015.
No, I'm not referring to bringing it back to our state for disposal. I'm talking about bringing it back to our state, or bringing it, or not necessarily even to our state, but at least looking into the opportunity of extracting the rest of that energy and putting it to a productive use, so that there isn't as much disposal concern sitting around the countryside. So I'm not saying we take the waste product, but I think there's a huge amount of unutilized energy that with today's technology, may be an opportunity.
Well, excuse me, Chairman Ward, you're talking about what was already described to us in the T-norm process, like on the oil fields and the
No.
sludge?
No. I'm talking about what's talked about in the leftover fuel cells from the power generation plants, where they've only utilized about 7% of the energy, and the rest of it sitting in a canister in a parking lot someplace, waiting to be, dealt with. Ed,
Chairman Ward, this is Josh. This is Josh with Commerce. I think that would be valuable, obviously, with the economic lens that I'm looking at things through. If that they're, like you said, we're an all the above energy state. If this is another piece to that equation, it seems like it's at least worth taking a look at it and see if it's a direction that the state wants to include in its high level kind of energy approach, from my perspective.
That's exactly what I'm thinking too, is that it's just another one. North Dakota has been known for its ability to produce energy of many different forms. I just would like to go down that road and look at that and see whether it's a viable option. And 5 years ago, we never thought of hydrogen being an option, and now today there's a number of conversations about hydrogen being discussed. And so I don't think we should be just ignoring this opportunity. We should look into it.
I wonder if I could follow up with that and ask Dan something that I've been kicking around since we heard from Stephen Curtis talk about this, the former DOE person who's been contacting every state and trying to set up a pilot for these small breeder reactors that would go around to each of these existing power plants or closed power plants where there's still spent fuel rods. And Dan, would you know, so if let's say you've got 100 tons of spent fuel rods, then you convert that uranium-238 to plutonium-239. It's ceramic, and Dave might know this too. Do you still end up with the exact same amount of waste because it's in those ceramic pellets and then in those fuel rods?
Right. Yes, because the volume is fixed essentially. It's just the element the form of the element changes that's in there, but really it doesn't change the volume at all. And then if you're planning, especially if you're planning to dispose of the entire fuel assembly, it's all one piece, and so you don't take it apart or dissolve it. So I was actually thinking, I heard Steve Curtis again last week at the conference I was at, and he's been saying, if I could just talk to one governor, get one governor to say he would take this fuel. So you've already heard from him. So, but yes, I'm sure there are people at the universities who are conversant with the fast reactor technology, who could give you a much better description of the capabilities than I can.
And we played back when we had Tim McCartan from NRC. Then we played that same meeting. We played, I think, about 15 minutes from a podcast that Steve Curtis was involved in, and then I spoke to him a couple times prior to that. Okay, good. We can certainly look into this.
All right. Committee members, anything else? Senator Patton, do I hear a motion?
So moved, whatever you're wanting to move.
Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
One quick question before we do that, Jim.
Good.
Ed, would you give me a call about that position?
Yep, I'll do that. This afternoon, okay?
Yep, that's fine. When we get done, it's fine.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Now, Senator Patton.
So moved, Regent.
Do I hear a second? Well, nobody wants to second. We can't adjourn. We just have to stay here all afternoon. Who seconded that?
This is John Piskowski.
Okay, John, thank you. All right, members, thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in about 6 months from now, okay?
Take care all. Thank you.
Yep, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.